A mountain man found her, an 18-year-old girl, heavy in body and burden, clinging to the low branch of a cottonwood. She was tied, and her fingers gripped the bark as if letting go would be the final surrender. Above her, nailed to the trunk, a crude wooden sign declared its verdict in uneven strokes: "Can't birth sons." He'd seen cruelty before, but never written so large for all to read. This was no simple act of malice. It was a mark meant to brand her, to strip her dignity, to erase her. Whoever put her there wanted more than humiliation. They wanted her gone. When he helped her down, he thought the worst had passed. He was wrong. Some wounds don't fade when the moment ends. They follow you, grow roots, and draw out the fight in unexpected ways. Because the men who marked her have a plan, a claim, and they will stop at nothing to take what they believe is theirs. The law will not stop them. Mercy will not change them. The only thing standing between her and what waits in the shadows is the man who pulled her from that tree. But the truth about her past could destroy them both. Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the falling snow, painting the Colorado wilderness in shades of purple and gray. Thaddeus McGraw guided his mule carefully along the frozen banks of Alder Creek, the leather of his saddle creaking with each deliberate step. His breath clouded in the winter air as his keen eyes scanned the terrain ahead, years of trapping having taught him to stay alert even on familiar trails. The cottonwoods stood like silent sentinels along the creek, their bare branches catching snowflakes that drifted down in lazy spirals. As Thaddeus rounded the bend, he pulled his mule to a sudden halt. There, suspended from a low branch, hung something that seemed entirely out of place in this empty landscape: a young woman. She clung to the branch with gloved hands, her dark face turned downward and her sturdy frame swaying slightly in the winter wind. Above her head, a wooden sign had been crudely nailed to the trunk, its harsh message painted in uneven letters: "Can't birth sons." Thaddeus felt his jaw tighten at the sight. He'd seen cruelty before, but this kind of public shame struck him as particularly mean-spirited. With slow, careful movements meant not to startle, he dismounted his mule. The snow crunched softly beneath his boots as he approached. "Miss," he called out, keeping his voice gentle, "are you hurt?" The young woman raised her head, and Thaddeus was struck by the quiet dignity in her expression, despite the tears that had frozen on her cheeks. Her voice, when she spoke, carried an unexpected strength. "No, sir, I ain't hurt. Not in body, anyway." She shifted slightly on the branch, her boots dangling just above the snow-covered ground. "I'm Dinah Grace Carter, 18 years old, daughter of Matthew Carter, freedman farmer." A shadow crossed her face. "Though Papa's been gone these 3 months now." Thaddeus moved closer, deliberately positioning himself where she could see him clearly. The light was growing dimmer by the minute, and the temperature was dropping fast. "I'm Thaddeus McGraw," he offered, noting how she held herself with remarkable composure despite her situation. "Mind telling me who done this to you?" Dinah's eyes flicked to the cruel sign above her head, then back to Thaddeus. "My former fiancé's kin, the Rourke brothers. They ... She paused, gathering herself. "They said since I can't give them grandsons, I ain't fit to marry into their family. Ran me off my own land, they did." The wind whistled through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise of a colder night ahead. Thaddeus studied the young woman's face, recognizing in her eyes the same kind of hurt he'd seen in his Cherokee mother's, the pain of being judged unworthy by those who had no right to judge. "Miss Carter," he said, moving closer to the tree. "Town ain't far, but night's coming fast. Allow me to help you down from there?" She hesitated for just a moment, likely weighing the risk of trusting a stranger against the certainty of freezing if she stayed. Then she nodded, her decision made with the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout their exchange. Thaddeus positioned himself beneath the branch, his strong hands reaching up. "Just let go when you're ready." "I won't let you fall." Dinah released her grip on the branch, and Thaddeus caught her substantial weight with steady arms, helping her find her footing in the snow. Up close, he could see that despite her size, she carried herself with a natural grace that matched her name. "Much obliged," she murmured, brushing snow from her skirts. Her eyes darted to his face, taking in his features, the mix of Cherokee and white blood evident in his appearance. Something in her expression softened, as if recognizing a fellow outsider. Thaddeus turned to the sign nailed to the tree, his hands already reaching for it. "This don't belong here," he said firmly, working the nails loose with practiced fingers. The wooden placard came free with a sharp crack, and he snapped it across his knee, tossing the pieces into the snow. The gesture seemed to release something in Dinah. She straightened her shoulders, standing taller. "Those Rourke brothers," she said, her voice stronger now. "They think they can shame me into giving up Papa's land, but I aim to prove them wrong." "Reckon that's a fight worth fighting," Thaddeus replied, leading his mule closer. "But first, we need to get you somewhere warm. Town's about an hour's ride from here." He paused, considering. "If you're willing to trust me that far?" Dinah looked at him steadily, then nodded. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Mr. McGraw. I reckon he sent you down this trail just when I needed someone most." Thaddeus helped her mount the mule, making sure she was secure before taking the reins to lead them toward town. The snow continued to fall softly around them as they made their way through the gathering dusk, their steps marking a new trail in the fresh powder. Neither spoke much as they traveled, but the silence between them was comfortable, the quiet understanding of two souls who knew what it meant to stand alone against the world's judgment. The only sounds were the mule's steady footfalls, the whisper of wind through the trees, and the distant call of a winter bird heading home before dark. The snow began falling harder as they made their way toward Alder Creek, the flakes now thick and heavy against the darkening sky. Thaddeus kept a firm grip on the mule's reins, guiding the animal carefully along the icy trail. He'd helped Dinah mount earlier, making sure she was secure in the saddle before starting their journey. "Watch your head there," he called out, pushing aside a snow-laden branch that hung low across their path. The wind had picked up, carrying a bitter chill that cut through even the thickest coat. Dinah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath visible in the cold air. "Papa's place ain't much," she said suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. "Just 40 acres and a cedar cabin he built himself. But it was ours, free and clear." Her voice caught slightly. "Or it was, till the Rourkes started claiming Papa owed them money." Thaddeus glanced up at her, noting the mix of pride and pain in her expression. "Your father, he leave any papers? Proof of ownership?" "Yes, sir. Locked away in Papa's strongbox." She shifted in the saddle, adjusting her skirts. "But Caleb, my former fiancé, he and his brothers, they got friends in town. Folk who'll back their word against mine." The mule's hooves crunched steadily through the fresh snow as Thaddeus considered this. He'd heard of the Rourke brothers during his infrequent trips to town, cattle ranchers with a reputation for expanding their holdings by any means necessary. "How long were you promised to Caleb?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. 6 months, Dinah replied softly, "till they found out I couldn't." She trailed off, then straightened her spine, "till they decided I wasn't suitable." Thaddeus nodded, understanding what she left unsaid. He'd seen enough of frontier life to know how some families valued bloodlines above all else. The wind howled around them, and he tugged his coat collar higher. After nearly an hour's careful travel, the lights of Alder Creek began to twinkle through the swirling snow. The boarding house stood near the edge of town, its windows glowing warm and inviting against the winter night. Thaddeus helped Dinah down from the mule, steadying her as her boots met the slick ground. The boarding house bell jingled as they entered, bringing a blast of cold air with them. Mrs. Talbot, a thin woman with sharp features, looked up from her desk, her eyes narrowed at the sight of Dinah, taking in her wind-chapped face and substantial frame. "We're full up," Mrs. Talbot said quickly, her lips pressed into a tight line. Thaddeus stepped forward, snow melting from his coat onto the wooden floor. "Evening, Mrs. Talbot. Miss Carter here needs a room for the night." He reached into his pocket, pulling out several coins. "I'll pay double your usual rate." Mrs. Talbot's expression wavered between suspicion and practical consideration. Finally, the sight of the money won out. "Room 12, top of the stairs," she said, sliding a key across the desk. "Supper's still warm in the dining room." Thaddeus nodded his thanks, guiding Dinah toward the dining room where a fire crackled in the hearth. The room was empty save for a few late diners finishing their meals. He pulled out a chair for Dinah near the fire, then spoke quietly to the serving girl about bringing hot food. As Dinah began to warm herself, the dining room door opened again. Mrs. Prudence Avery, the town's midwife, entered, shaking snow from her shawl. Her eyes fell on Dinah, and a flash of recognition crossed her weathered face. She moved deliberately toward Thaddeus, touching his arm. "Mr. McGraw, might I have a word?" Thaddeus followed her to a quiet corner of the room, where Mrs. Avery spoke in low, urgent tones. "I know that girl," she said, glancing toward Dinah. "Saw her some months back when she was engaged to young Caleb Rourke. There was talk about her ability to bear children." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "She had scarlet fever as a child. Bad case. Left her barren, I expect, though it's not something easily proved." Thaddeus absorbed this information silently, his eyes on Dinah as she accepted a bowl of hot stew from the serving girl. Mrs. Avery wasn't finished. "Those Rourke brothers. They're dangerous men, Mr. McGraw. Not the type to let go of what they think is theirs. They'll come looking for her. Mark my words." "Because of the land?" Thaddeus asked quietly. "The land, their pride, their notion of family honor. Take your pick." Mrs. Avery's face was grim. "They've run other folks off their claims before. Always legal-like, on paper at least. But there's usually more to the story." Thaddeus thanked her for the warning, then walked back to the fire where Dinah sat eating her stew. She looked up as he approached, and something in his expression must have betrayed his concern. "Mrs. Avery told you, didn't she?" Dinah asked softly. "About the fever?" He nodded, settling into the chair across from her. The firelight played across her face, highlighting both her youth and the strength that seemed to radiate from within. "I don't need pity, Mr. McGraw," she said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly as she set down her spoon. "What I need is justice. That land was my father's dream, everything he worked for after getting his freedom. I aim to keep it, children or no children." Thaddeus watched the flames dance in the hearth, feeling the weight of Mrs. Avery's warning settling in his chest. The Rourke brothers wouldn't take kindly to their former future bride turning up in town, especially after they'd gone to such lengths to humiliate her. Yet here sat Dinah Grace Carter, eating her stew with quiet dignity, refusing to be broken by their cruelty. The snow continued to fall outside the boarding house windows, and somewhere in the night, 3 brothers might already be planning their next move. But for now, at least, Dinah was safe and warm, with a hot meal before her and a solid roof above her head. Morning light crept across Alder Creek's main street, turning the fresh snow into a blanket of sparkling diamonds. The air was crisp and clean after the storm, though thin clouds suggested more weather might be coming. Thaddeus stood at the boarding house steps, helping Dinah navigate the slippery wooden boards. "Easy now," he said, offering his arm for support. "Ice under all that powder." Dinah accepted his help with a grateful nod, her boots crunching in the snow. "Much obliged, Mr. McGraw, for everything." She paused, drawing her shawl tighter. "But I can't keep depending on your charity. Perhaps I could find work in town, maybe cooking or cleaning." Thaddeus shook his head, watching 2 women hurry past on the boardwalk, their whispers carrying clearly in the morning air. "Town's got a long memory, Miss Carter. And those Rourke brothers, they got friends here." He turned to face her directly. "My cabin up in the high country, it ain't much, but it's private. You'd be welcome there till spring thaw opens the passes." Surprise flickered across Dinah's face, followed by uncertainty. "That's kind of you. But I wouldn't want to be a burden." "No burden," Thaddeus replied simply. "Got space enough and winter's a quiet time. Could use the company, truth be told." He didn't mention how the thought of leaving her alone in town, vulnerable to the Rourke's schemes, sat heavy in his chest. Instead, he gestured toward the general store. Need supplies anyway. Might as well stock up for 2. Inside the store, Thaddeus efficiently gathered what they'd need: flour, beans, coffee, and lamp oil. The shopkeeper's eyes followed Dinah as she examined a display of dried herbs, but he said nothing under Thaddeus's steady gaze. Loading the supplies onto his mule took little time. Thaddeus had just secured the last pack when voices carried from the saloon doorway. "Well, if it ain't the barren woman," one man called out, tobacco juice staining his beard. "Saw that sign they put up. Reckon it's true what they say about you." His companion laughed, the sound ugly in the morning air. "Too much woman there anyway. Who'd want to breed with—" The words died in his throat as Thaddeus turned slowly, his dark eyes fixed on the men. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, muscles tight beneath his buckskin coat. Something in his expression made both men step back, mumbling excuses as they retreated into the saloon. Dinah had gone very still, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. Thaddeus touched her elbow gently. "Time we were going, Miss Carter." They left town quietly, the mule's hooves breaking fresh trail through the snow. The path wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, their branches heavy with white. Dinah walked beside Thaddeus, her stride steady despite the difficult terrain. By midday, the wind had picked up considerably, driving loose snow into their faces. Dark clouds gathered overhead, promising more storms to come. Thaddeus studied the sky with concern. "Got a line shack up ahead," he said, raising his voice above the wind. "Best wait out this weather there." The old trapper's cabin appeared through the swirling snow, a simple one-room structure with a stone chimney. Inside, it was cold but dry. Thaddeus quickly got a fire going while Dinah brushed snow from their coats. As warmth began filling the small space, Dinah settled near the flames. Almost unconsciously, she started humming, a low, sweet sound that made Thaddeus pause in his work. The melody tugged at something in his memory. Summer evenings long ago, his mother's people gathered around different fires, singing the same hymn in Cherokee and English both. "Know that one," he said quietly, arranging kindling for the night. "My mother used to sing it at camp meetings." Dinah's humming stopped. "Your mother? She was Cherokee?" Thaddeus nodded, adding another log to the fire. "Had a voice like yours, clear and true." He didn't mention how she'd been gone 20 years now, or how rarely he spoke of her to anyone. As evening deepened outside, they shared a simple meal of beans and trail bread. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, but inside was warm and secure. When it came time to sleep, Thaddeus insisted Dinah take the narrow cot while he made his bed near the hearth. "I'll keep the fire going," he said, settling onto his bedroll. "Get some rest, Miss Carter. Still got a fair piece to travel tomorrow." Dinah pulled the rough blanket up to her chin. "Thank you, Mr. McGraw, for everything." Thaddeus just nodded, his eyes on the flames. Outside, snow continued falling, and somewhere in the darkness, a lone owl called. He stayed awake, tending the fire and keeping watch, while Dinah's breathing gradually steadied into sleep. The small cabin was quiet save for the crack of burning wood and the whisper of wind. Thaddeus knew the morning would bring its own challenges, more miles to cover, more weather to face. But for now, at least, they had warmth and shelter, and sometimes that was enough. He added another log to the fire, watching sparks rise up the chimney. The night stretched ahead, long and dark, but he was used to keeping vigil. He'd learned long ago that some things, some people, were worth protecting, worth watching over through the darker hours until dawn. Dawn broke clear and cold over the line shack. Frost had gathered on the small window, creating delicate patterns that caught the early light. Thaddeus was already up, stirring cornmeal into boiling water over the rekindled fire. The familiar motions of making breakfast helped quiet his mind after the long night's watch. Dinah woke to the warm smell of cooking. She sat up on the cot, adjusting her shawl against the morning chill. "Good morning, Mr. McGraw." "Morning," he replied, spooning the thick mush into 2 tin bowls. "Eat while it's hot. Got a fair climb ahead of us today." They shared their simple breakfast in comfortable silence. The cornmeal mush wasn't fancy, but it was filling and warm. Through the cabin's window, they could see fresh snow had fallen during the night, adding to what was already on the ground. Once they'd cleaned up and gathered their things, they set out. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine white landscape, but offered little warmth. Thaddeus led the way, breaking trail through deep snow while leading his laden mule. Dinah followed in his footsteps, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. The trail wound steadily upward through stands of pine and spruce. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and occasionally a branch would release its white burden with a soft thump. The mule plodded steadily onward, though progress was slow in the deep drifts. By midday, they'd climbed well into the mountains. Thaddeus called a brief halt in a sheltered spot, sharing dried beef and hard biscuits. The winter silence wrapped around them, broken only by an occasional jay's harsh call or the distant crack of a snow-laden branch. "Not much further now," Thaddeus said, adjusting the mule's pack straps. "Cabins just over the next ridge." The afternoon sun was low in the sky when they finally crested the last rise. Below them, in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, sat a sturdy log cabin. Smoke from an earlier fire still curled from its stone chimney. "Home," Thaddeus said simply, leading the way down. The cabin was snug and well-built, its logs chinked tight against the mountain winds. A small barn stood nearby, where Thaddeus led the mule while Dinah waited by the cabin door. When he returned, he quickly ushered her inside. The interior was dim but tidy. A large iron stove dominated one wall, while rough-hewn shelves held cooking implements and supplies. A narrow bed occupied one corner, and a simple table with 2 chairs stood in another. Everything was plain but serviceable, speaking of a life lived simply but with care. "Let me get that stove going proper," Thaddeus said, already moving to add wood and adjust the damper. "Then I'll fetch some water from the spring." While he worked at bringing warmth back to the space, Dinah stood taking it all in. Her eyes traced the neat rows of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the stack of furs in one corner, the worn but clean floorboards. Thaddeus disappeared briefly outside, returning with 2 buckets of ice-cold spring water. As he set them near the stove to warm, he paused, then walked to a wooden chest beneath the window. From it, he pulled a carefully folded quilt, its pattern still bright despite its age. "Was my mother's," he said quietly, holding it out to Dinah. "Reckon you could use it." Dinah accepted the quilt with visible care, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Are you certain?" Thaddeus nodded, already turning to unpack their supplies. The afternoon light was fading fast outside the cabin's windows as they settled into a routine. Dinah helped organize the provisions, while Thaddeus prepared a simple stew with dried venison and the vegetables they'd brought from town. As the stew simmered, filling the cabin with its rich aroma, they sat at the table. The stove's warmth had made the space cozy, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky outside. "My father was so proud when he bought our land," Dinah said suddenly, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea. "Worked 3 years saving for it. Said no one could take it from us, now that we owned it proper." She paused, pain flickering across her face. "He didn't reckon on the Rourkes finding ways around the law." Thaddeus listened quietly as she continued, telling of her mother's death from fever when Dinah was 12, how she'd learned to keep house and tend the garden alone. When she spoke of Caleb Rourke's courtship, her voice grew softer. "He seemed kind at first, said he didn't mind that I was different from other girls. Then his brothers started talking about heirs, about carrying on the family name." She looked down at her hands. "When they found out I couldn't give them that." "Ain't right," Thaddeus said quietly, "judging folks only by what they can give you." He rose and stirred the stew, then surprised her by sitting back down and speaking again. "My mother's people tell a story," he began. his voice taking on the rhythm of a tale often told. About a woman who lived alone with no children of her own. While others whispered about her empty arms, she spent her days planting gardens. Fed any who were hungry, taught young ones how to make things grow. He paused, adding softly, "Years later, when she passed, they found whole valleys blooming with her flowers. Generations of folk still gathering food from trees she planted." Dinah's eyes glistened in the lamplight. She left her mark on the world, even without bearing children. "Every person's got their own way of nurturing life," Thaddeus agreed. "Ain't always the way others expect." They ate their stew in companionable silence after that, while outside the snow began falling again. The soft hiss of flakes against the window and the crackle of the stove created a peaceful backdrop to their meal. As night fully claimed the mountain, the snow continued to fall heavily, building drifts against the cabin walls. They were well and truly cut off now until spring thaw, but inside the cabin was warm and secure. Thaddeus showed Dinah where she could hang her mother's quilt to create a private sleeping space, then banked the stove for the night. The cabin settled into darkness except for the stove's gentle glow. Through the window, the snow-covered world gleamed faintly under the clouds, wild and beautiful in its isolation. But inside, two souls who had known too much loneliness had found, at least for this winter, a measure of peace in each other's quiet company. Dawn crept slowly over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in soft shades of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, Thaddeus stirred the banked coals in the stove, adding small pieces of kindling until flames caught and danced. Dinah woke to the familiar sounds and smells of morning, the crack of wood splitting, the metallic clang of the stove door, and the rich aroma of coffee brewing. She adjusted her shawl and emerged from behind the quilt partition. "Time you learned the daily chores," Thaddeus said, pouring 2 cups of steaming coffee. "Can't spend all winter waiting on me to do everything." After a breakfast of cornbread and dried apple slices, Thaddeus led Dinah outside. The morning air bit sharp and clean, making their breath visible in white puffs. He showed her to the woodpile, demonstrating how to split the smaller logs into kindling. "Like this," he said, positioning a piece of wood on the chopping block. The axe came down with practiced ease, splitting the wood cleanly. "Mind your fingers, and let the weight of the axe do the work." Dinah's first attempts were clumsy. The axe felt heavy and awkward in her hands, and more than once it stuck in the wood without splitting it. But she persisted, her face set with determination. "You'll get the feel of it," Thaddeus assured her, watching as she finally managed a clean split. "Just takes practice." Next, he showed her how to bank the stove's fire properly, explaining how to regulate the heat by adjusting the damper. "Too hot, and you'll waste wood. Too cool, and will freeze come nightfall." They moved on to checking the nearby snares, simple wire loops set along game trails. Most were empty, but one held a plump snowshoe hare. Thaddeus demonstrated how to reset the snare, his movements quick and efficient. "Lord gave us these creatures for sustenance," he said quietly, holding the hare. "We honor them by not wasting what they provide." Back at the cabin, Dinah watched carefully as he showed her how to clean and prepare the hare for cooking. Her hands were steady, though her face showed her discomfort with the task. The next few days settled into a rhythm. Each morning, Thaddeus would head out to check his trap lines further in the woods, while Dinah tended to the cabin. She struggled at first with the physical demands of the chores, but her determination never wavered. By the 3rd day, she had mastered the art of keeping the stove at just the right temperature. She discovered that baking bread helped warm the cabin, and the familiar task gave her a sense of purpose. The first loaf was heavy and dark-crusted, but Thaddeus ate it without complaint. "Tastes just fine," he said, sopping up rabbit stew with a thick slice. "Reminds me of my mother's bread." On the 4th evening, Thaddeus returned from his trapline to find the cabin filled with the sound of soft singing. He paused at the door, listening. Dinah sat by the window, the fading light catching her face as she worked on one of his old shirts. Her voice carried the melody of an old spiritual, rich and clear in the quiet space. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The words filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling stove. Thaddeus stood longer than he meant to, letting the song wash over him. When she finished, he finally moved, making enough noise with his boots to announce his presence. "That was pretty," he said simply, hanging his snow-covered coat by the door. Dinah ducked her head, slightly embarrassed. "Just keeping my hands and mind occupied. Your shirt needed mending." They prepared supper together. More rabbit stew, this time with dumplings Dinah had made from the morning's bread dough. As they ate, she studied his face in the lamplight. "Mr. McGraw," she began hesitantly, "why do you live up here all alone?" Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, stirring his stew. When he spoke, his voice was low but clear. "Fever took my family when I was young. Father, sister's baby brother. Mother held on longer, taught me what she could of her people's ways." He paused, his eyes distant. "But folks down in the settlements, they didn't take kindly to Cherokee blood. Called us savages, wouldn't trade fair. Mother's kin had already been pushed west by then. Most of them anyway." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "After she passed, I found it easier to live up here. Mountains don't care what blood runs in a man's veins." Dinah nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "Some hurts run too deep for words," she said softly. "Some folks can't see past what's on the outside to know what's in a person's heart." "That's the truth of it," Thaddeus agreed. They sat in companionable silence as the wind picked up outside. Soon, the soft pat of snow against the windows told them another storm had moved in. The sound only made the cabin feel more secure, a warm haven against the winter's fury. "My mama used to say that God puts people in our path for a reason," Dinah said thoughtfully, gathering their empty bowls. "Even if we don't understand it at the time." Thaddeus watched as she moved about the cabin, her movements more confident now than they had been days ago. "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Dinah replied, her voice warm with memory. "Taught me that strength comes in many forms, and that kindness is never wasted." Outside, the snow continued to fall heavily, building fresh drifts against the cabin walls. The mountain world grew smaller, more intimate, as winter sealed them in their refuge. But neither felt trapped. Instead, there was a growing sense of peace in their shared solitude, a healing in the simple rhythms of their days. That night, as they prepared for sleep, the wind sang through the pine trees and the stove cast warm shadows on the walls. Their small world was contained within these log walls, but it was enough. For now, it was more than enough. Early December brought a softer rhythm to life in the mountain cabin. The harsh edges of winter seemed to smooth away as Dinah and Thaddeus settled into their shared routines. The interior of the cabin had transformed from merely functional to genuinely welcoming, with Dinah's touch evident in small but meaningful ways. One morning, she gathered fresh pine boughs from the trees near the cabin, carefully arranging them on the rough-hewn table. The fresh scent of pine filled the small space, bringing the forest's freshness indoors. Thaddeus watched her work, noting how she hummed quietly to herself as she adjusted each branch just so. "Reckon that table's never looked so fine," he commented, running a weathered hand over the fragrant needles. Dinah smiled, pleased by his notice. "Every home needs a bit of beauty, even way up here." Thaddeus had been working on a surprise of his own. For several days, he'd spent his evenings carefully crafting a chair sized especially for Dinah. He'd selected the sturdiest oak pieces from his woodpile, making sure each joint was strong and true. When he finally presented it to her, the care in its construction was evident. "Made it extra sturdy," he explained, almost shy about the gift. "Should hold comfortable like." Dinah ran her hands over the smooth, sanded arms, touched by the thoughtfulness. When she sat, the chair held her weight perfectly, neither creaking nor shifting. "It's wonderful," she said softly. "Thank you." One crisp morning, with the sun bright on the snow, they set out together to haul firewood. Thaddeus had rigged a simple wooden sled, and they worked as a team, loading it with split logs. The air was sharp and clean, their breath forming clouds as they worked. "Mind the slope here," Thaddeus warned as they started back. But even as he spoke, the sled hit an icy patch. It tipped slowly, almost comically, spilling logs into the snow. Dinah's laugh rang out, surprising them both with its heartiness. "Oh Lord," she gasped, trying to catch her breath. "Look at all our hard work." Thaddeus found himself chuckling too, the sound rusty but genuine. They gathered the scattered wood together, still sharing occasional bursts of laughter at their mishap. Later that week, Thaddeus needed to make a trip into Alder Creek to trade his furs. The pelts he'd collected were prime winter catches, their fur thick and glossy. At the trading post, he carefully negotiated for supplies: coffee, salt, sugar for Dinah's baking. But his eye caught on something special: a bolt of calico fabric, printed with tiny blue flowers. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow when Thaddeus added it to his purchases, but said nothing. Thaddeus knew Dinah had been making do with her old dress, carefully washed and mended. She deserved something new, something pretty. While loading his purchases, he spotted Mrs. Abigail Dunham, the preacher's wife, approaching with purpose in her step. She was a commanding presence despite her small frame, and her face held genuine warmth. "Mr. McGraw," she called out, "I heard Miss Carter was staying with you through the winter." Thaddeus nodded, careful with his words. "She's safe there." "I'm glad to hear it." Mrs. Dunham's eyes were kind but direct. "We're planning our Christmas Eve service, and I wondered, would Miss Carter consider singing for us? I've heard tell of her voice, and we could use some special music." When Thaddeus relayed the invitation that evening, Dinah's hands stilled over her mending. "I don't know," she said quietly. "The way folks talked before." "You sing like an angel," Thaddeus said simply. "Let them hear it. Might change some minds." Dinah considered this, her fingers tracing the pattern on the calico he'd brought her. "Maybe you're right. Mama always said music could open hearts where words fail." Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold, the stars sharp as diamond chips in the darkening sky. The little church glowed with candlelight, every window a beacon in the winter night. Thaddeus helped Dinah down from the wagon, noting how fine she looked in her new calico dress, which she'd somehow managed to sew in secret moments. The church was full, every pew occupied with families in their Christmas best. Whispers followed their entrance, but Mrs. Dunham met them at the door with a warm welcome. "We're so pleased you could come," she said, leading Dinah to the front where the other musicians waited. Thaddeus found a spot near the back, his tall frame unusual in the church setting. He watched as Dinah took her place, saw her shoulders square with dignity despite the watching eyes. When she began to sing, the whispers ceased. Her voice filled the small church, pure and strong, lifting the words of Silent Night toward the rafters. The candlelight caught the tears on her cheeks, but her voice never wavered. Each note carried conviction, faith, and a grace that transcended judgment. The final notes faded into absolute silence. Then, starting from the back and rolling forward, applause filled the church. It wasn't the polite kind, but genuine appreciation. Thaddeus saw several women dabbing at their eyes, and even some of the hard-faced ranchers nodded with respect. After the service, people gathered around Dinah, offering sincere compliments. Mrs. Dunham beamed like a proud mother, her arm linked through Dinah's. When they finally made their way outside, Dinah's cheeks were flushed with joy, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank you for encouraging me," she said softly to Thaddeus as he helped her into the wagon. "I'd forgotten how it feels to share music like that." The moonlight silvered the snow as they drove back toward the mountains, the church's warmth and light living on in their memories. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the echoes of song and the simple joy of acceptance freely given. Christmas morning dawned peaceful and still, the mountain air crisp and clean. Inside the cabin, a small fire crackled in the stove, casting warm light across the wooden floors. Thaddeus woke early, as was his habit, and quietly stoked the flames before putting on coffee to brew. Dinah emerged from behind the quilt he'd hung as a makeshift curtain for her sleeping area, her eyes bright with the special anticipation that only Christmas morning brings. "Merry Christmas," she said softly, smoothing her worn dress. "Merry Christmas to you," Thaddeus replied, reaching for a wrapped bundle he'd tucked away on a high shelf. Got something for you. Dinah's eyes widened as she carefully unwrapped the calico fabric he'd bought in town. The tiny blue flowers scattered across the cloth seemed to dance in the morning light. She ran her fingers over the material, tears welling in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I haven't had new fabric since before Papa passed." "Figured you might want something fresh for spring," Thaddeus said, ducking his head slightly. "Well then," Dinah said, wiping her eyes and reaching for something beneath her bed. "I have something for you too." She presented him with a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a warm scarf, knitted in deep brown wool she'd carefully unraveled from an old shawl. The stitches were neat and even, showing hours of secret work. "Been working on it when you're out checking traps," she explained. "Noticed your old one was pretty worn through." Thaddeus wrapped the scarf around his neck, touched by the gesture. "Much obliged," he said softly. "Real fine work." For their Christmas dinner, Thaddeus had saved a plump rabbit, which Dinah roasted with some precious dried herbs she'd found in the cabin's stores. As they ate, the conversation turned naturally to the future. "Been thinking," Dinah said, carefully cutting her meat, "about what comes after winter." Thaddeus looked up, waiting for her to continue. "I know I can't stay here forever," she went on, "but I'm not sure what's left for me down in Alder Creek, with Papa's land gone and all." "Time enough to figure that," Thaddeus said gently. "No need to rush decisions." The days following Christmas brought unexpected changes. The ice began to thaw just enough to make the trail to town passable, and with it came visitors. The first was Mrs. Dunham, the preacher's wife, bearing a sweet potato pie and a determined expression. "That singing on Christmas Eve was a blessing," she declared, setting the pie on Thaddeus's table. "We need more music in this town." Other visitors followed. Mrs. Talbot from the boarding house brought a patchwork quilt, and even some of the ranchers' wives made the trip up, carrying preserves and fresh bread. Each visitor seemed to study Dinah carefully, as if trying to reconcile the powerful voice they'd heard with the large young woman before them. Dinah's gift for music opened an unexpected door. Mrs. Dunham suggested she teach hymns to the children who stayed at the boarding house. The first lesson was arranged in the parlor, with 6 young ones gathered around as Dinah taught them Amazing Grace. "You've got to feel it here," she explained, touching her heart. "The words are important, but the feeling is what makes it fly." The children took to her naturally, untroubled by adult prejudices. Soon their clear voices could be heard practicing hymns in the afternoon, bringing new life to the boarding house's stuffy parlor. But not all changes were positive. Whispers still followed Dinah through town, taking on new, darker tones. Some folks claimed she must have bewitched Thaddeus, wondering what spell a woman like her could have cast on the solitary mountain man. Others speculated cruelly about her condition, suggesting darker reasons for her isolation. Thaddeus heard these rumors during his trips to trade furs. His jaw tightened each time, but he knew confrontation would only fuel the gossip. Instead, he warned Dinah one evening as she prepared to walk home from teaching. "Best not to go into town alone," he said, his voice grave. "Some folks ain't changed their minds yet." Dinah straightened her spine, her chin lifting with quiet dignity. "I won't hide away," she said firmly. "That's what they want, for me to shrink down small and disappear. But God made me exactly as I am, and I aim to walk proud." Thaddeus recognized the steel in her voice, the same strength that had kept her hanging onto that tree branch months ago, rather than running away in shame. He nodded slowly, respecting her decision while silently vowing to keep closer watch. The new year arrived with a heavy snowfall that transformed the landscape. Deep drifts blocked the trails, and the world seemed to hold its breath under the white blanket. In the cabin, Dinah stood at the window, watching the snow fall in the gray dawn light. "Looks like the Lord's starting us fresh," she said softly, her breath fogging the glass, covering up all the old tracks. Thaddeus came to stand beside her, both of them watching the transformation outside. The snow continued to fall, each flake adding to the clean, white expanse that stretched from their door down to the sleeping town below. The first week of January brought bitter winds to Alder Creek, rattling shop windows and sending townsfolk hurrying between buildings with collars turned up against the cold. On a particularly gray afternoon, 3 riders appeared through the swirling snow, their horses' hooves crunching against the frozen ground. The men dismounted outside the Bull's Head Saloon, their spurs jingling against the wooden walkway. Caleb Rourke, the youngest of the 3 brothers, stepped through the swinging doors first, followed by Jonas and Levi. The warmth inside did nothing to soften their cold expressions as they surveyed the room. "Mighty cold ride from Denver," Caleb announced, brushing snow from his coat. His voice carried an edge that made the card players at the corner table pause their game. "Seems my former bride-to-be has taken up residence in these parts." The saloon grew quiet except for the soft crackle of the pot-bellied stove. A few men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, while others suddenly found their drinks fascinating. The bartender wiped the same spot on the bar over and over, avoiding eye contact. Jonas, the middle brother, leaned against the bar. "Ain't that peculiar? Nobody seems interested in helping 3 honest businessmen locate their kin." His hand rested casually near his holster, a gesture not lost on the room's occupants. Levi, the eldest, pulled out a chair and sat, his calculating gaze sweeping the room. "We heard tell she's been staying with that half-breed trapper up in the hills. That true?" Finally, one of the ranch hands cleared his throat. "Might be. McGraw keeps to himself mostly, but he's been seen with her. They came to the Christmas service together." "Christmas service?" Caleb's laugh held no humor. "Well, ain't that sweet? The barren woman and the mountain man playing house." The brothers ordered whiskey and settled in, their presence casting a shadow over the normally boisterous saloon. As the afternoon wore on, their questions became more pointed, their manner more threatening. By evening, a young ranch hand named Tommy slipped away from town, urging his horse through the gathering darkness toward Thaddeus's cabin. The boys' urgent knocking interrupted Dinah and Thaddeus's quiet supper. "Mr. McGraw," Tommy called through the door, his voice carrying a tremor of worry. "Got news you need to hear." Thaddeus opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air along with the agitated youth. Tommy removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Dinah before delivering his message. "The Rourke brothers are in town, all 3 of them. They're asking after Miss Dinah, and they don't sound friendly about it." Dinah's face paled, but she kept her composure. "Thank you for riding up to tell us, Tommy," she said softly. After the boy left, Thaddeus watched Dinah sink into her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We knew they might come," he said quietly. "Yes," she whispered. "But I hoped they'd forgotten about me." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Dinah insisted on going into town for her regular hymn teaching at the boarding house, despite Thaddeus's concerns. He accompanied her, his eyes constantly scanning the street as they walked. They had just finished crossing the muddy main street when 3 figures stepped out of the general store. Caleb Rourke's face twisted into an ugly smile when he spotted Dinah. "Well, if it ain't the runaway bride herself," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Jonas and Levi flanked him, spreading out to block the path. Dinah lifted her chin, though Thaddeus could see her hands trembling. "I have nothing to say to you, Caleb Rourke." "Oh, but we have plenty to say to you." Levi pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Your dear departed father left some unfinished business with our family. We've got here a promissory note for $200 plus interest." "That's a lie," Dinah said firmly. "My father never borrowed money from your family." "Paper says different." Jonas waved the document. "Signed and witnessed proper. Marshall's already looked it over." Indeed, the town marshal stood watching from the boardwalk, his thumbs hooked in his belt, making no move to intervene. "You've got 1 week," Caleb declared, his voice carrying down the street. "Either you come back and make things right with me, or we'll take that homestead for payment. And that pretty headstone your mama's got might not weather the change in ownership too well." Thaddeus stepped forward, his quiet voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You're threatening a grave marker now? That's mighty low, even for you 3. "Ain't threatening nothing," Levi said smoothly. "Just stating facts about property rights. 1 week, Dinah. Choose careful." Thaddeus placed a gentle hand on Dinah's arm, steering her away from the brothers. She walked with her head high, but he could feel her trembling. They didn't speak until they were safely back in the cabin. As evening settled over the mountain, Dinah sat by the window, staring out at the snowy peaks. "I won't go back to them," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I'd rather lose every acre than be bound to men like that." Thaddeus built up the fire, giving her time to collect her thoughts. "But that land," she continued, her voice catching, "it was everything to Papa. He worked so hard to buy it, to build something that was truly ours. And Mama ... She wiped her eyes. "That marker was the only thing we could afford when she passed. It ain't much, but it's all I have left of her." Thaddeus watched the flames dance in the stove, his jaw tight with barely contained fury at the brothers' cruelty. He'd seen men like them before, using the law as a weapon against those who couldn't fight back. But watching Dinah's quiet dignity in the face of their threats had stirred something deep within him, a determination that justice would prevail, one way or another. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant cry of a night bird. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below, while inside, two souls wrestled with questions of legacy, justice, and the price of standing one's ground. The storm descended suddenly, as mountain weather often does. Heavy snow drove against the cabin windows while wind moaned through the pine trees, turning the world white. Inside, Thaddeus stoked the fire higher, adding another log as Dinah wrapped herself tighter in his mother's quilt. "Reckon we're stuck here for a spell," he said, straightening up from the stove. The familiar scent of wood smoke filled the small space as he watched thick flakes swirl past the frosted glass. Dinah nodded, her eyes distant. The brothers' threat about her mother's grave marker still weighed heavily on her mind. They both knew the 1-week deadline was ticking away, even as the blizzard raged outside. Through that first day of the storm, they kept busy with indoor tasks. Dinah worked at patching Thaddeus's spare shirts while he repaired a broken snowshoe, the bitter wind rattling the cabin's sturdy logs. They spoke little, each lost in thought about the predicament they faced. As evening approached, Thaddeus finally broke their companionable silence. "Been thinking on those papers the Rourkes showed." He tested the snowshoe's binding with careful fingers. "Something ain't right about that debt they claim." "Papa kept careful records," Dinah said, looking up from her mending. "He never mentioned owing them anything." "Exactly why I'm minded to ride to the county seat," Thaddeus said quietly. "Check the official records, maybe talk to a proper lawyer." Dinah's hands stilled in her lap. "But that's near 50 miles in good weather. In winter, ... She shook her head, genuine fear crossing her face. "The passes will be treacherous. You could freeze or worse." "Got to try something," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Can't let them steal your inheritance with false papers." The second day of their snowbound confinement dawned gray and hostile. The storm showed no signs of weakening as they went about their tasks. Thaddeus inspected his gear methodically, checking straps, oiling leather, counting ammunition. Every so often he caught Dinah watching him with worried eyes. They shared a simple lunch of beans and cornbread near the stove. "Tell me about your father's farm," Thaddeus asked, hoping to lift her spirits. "What kind of man was he?" Dinah's face softened at the memories. "He was quiet like you, but strong in his convictions. Worked from sunrise to sunset, building something honest." She smiled faintly. "He used to say, 'Grace ain't nothing sweeter than eating vegetables you grew with your own hands.' Sounds like a wise man." He was. Her smile faded. "That's why I know he'd never have borrowed money from the Rourkes. He distrusted them, said they were the type to smile while holding a knife behind their back." As afternoon faded toward evening, they worked together to mend Thaddeus's winter coat. Dinah's skilled fingers closed up a tear in the sleeve while he replaced a broken button. The familiar tasks kept their hands busy while their minds churned with worry. "My mother used to say that mending clothes together was a way of showing care," Thaddeus said softly, watching Dinah's neat stitches. In her people's way, it meant you wished someone safe travels. Dinah's eyes glistened in the lamplight. Then I'll put extra care in every stitch. The wind died down during the night, and they woke to an altered world. Fresh snow lay deep and unmarked around the cabin, while the morning sun turned everything to sparkling crystal. The storm had passed, leaving behind an almost unnatural stillness. Thaddeus began his preparations early, packing his saddlebags with careful precision. He wrapped dried venison in oiled paper, added hard biscuits and coffee beans, and made sure his tinderbox was well supplied. Every item had to be chosen with purpose. Too little could mean death in the winter mountains. Too much could slow his progress dangerously. Dinah moved around the cabin restlessly as he worked, clearly struggling with his decision to make the journey. Finally, she disappeared into the corner where she kept her few possessions, returning with a worn leather book. "This was Papa's Bible," she said, holding it out to him. "He read from it every morning and every night. Carried it through the war, through freedom, through building our farm." Her voice wavered slightly. "I want you to take it with you. For luck." Thaddeus accepted the Bible carefully, aware of the profound trust she was placing in him. The leather was smooth from years of handling, the pages well thumbed and marked with pressed flowers. This was more than a book. It was her family's history, their anchor through hard times. "I'll guard it with my life," he promised, tucking it securely in his inside coat pocket, close to his heart. They shared one last cup of coffee as the sun climbed higher in the crystal-clear sky. Dinah had insisted on making him extra biscuits, though they both knew he could only carry so much. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them in a clean cloth. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said, helping him secure the last of his supplies to the saddle. "The passes." "I know these mountains," he assured her, checking the cinch one final time. "Been riding them 20 years now." Still. She looked up at him, her dark eyes full of concern. "You're risking yourself for my sake. If anything happened to you—" "Nothing's going to happen," he said firmly. "I'll be back before you know it, hopefully with proof to stop those brothers in their tracks." The morning sun caught the tears on her cheeks as she stepped back from the mule. Thaddeus adjusted his heavy coat, making sure the Bible was secure against his chest. The weight of it reminded him of all that was at stake, not just Dinah's land, but her dignity, her future, her very place in the world. "Bar the door at night," he instructed, mounting up. "Keep the rifle loaded. I've asked Tommy to check on you when he can." Dinah nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "God go with you, Thaddeus McGraw." He touched the brim of his hat in response, then turned the mule toward the trail. The animal's hooves broke through the fresh snow with quiet determination as they started down the mountain, leaving Dinah standing in the doorway of the cabin, her prayers following them into the vast white wilderness. The first day on the trail tested both man and beast. Thaddeus's mule picked its way carefully through knee-deep snow, while icy wind cut through his layers of wool and leather. The Bible pressed against his chest beneath his coat, a constant reminder of his promise to Dinah. By midday, dark clouds rolled in, forcing them to seek shelter beneath a rocky overhang. Thaddeus gathered pine boughs for a makeshift bed and started a small fire, just enough to heat coffee and thaw his frozen bread. The mule stood nearby, steam rising from its flanks. "Easy there, old friend," he murmured, sharing a biscuit with the animal. "Still got a long way ahead." That night, huddled close to dying embers, Thaddeus dreamed of warm cabins and Dinah's hymns. The wind's howl reminded him of her voice, strong and clear despite all that tried to silence it. Dawn brought clearer skies but deeper cold. Ice had formed in his canteen, and his breath frosted thick on his scarf. The second day's journey led them down into a narrow valley where an ice-choked river blocked their path. Thaddeus spent an hour searching for a safe crossing, testing the ice with his staff until he found a spot where it would bear their weight. "Steady now," he coached the mule, leading it step by careful step across the frozen surface. Halfway across, the ice creaked ominously. The mule's eyes rolled white with fear. but Thaddeus kept his voice calm, speaking softly until they reached the far bank. That evening, he made camp in a grove of cedars, their branches offering some protection from the bitter wind. His fingers were too numb to properly strike his flint, and it took 3 tries before the tinder caught. As feeling returned to his hands, pain shot through them like needles. The third morning dawned bright and cruel. Thaddeus's beard was heavy with ice, and his provisions had dwindled to a handful of frozen biscuits. The county seat lay in the valley below, its chimney smoke rising straight in the still air. By mid-morning, he rode down the town's main street, past curious onlookers who stared at his frost-covered figure. The courthouse stood at the far end, a 2-story brick building with white columns. Thaddeus tied his mule at the hitching post, stamping his feet to restore circulation before climbing the steps. Inside, a pot-bellied stove warmed the entrance hall. A clerk looked up from his desk, eyeing Thaddeus's wild appearance with concern. "Help you, mister?" Thaddeus pulled Mrs. Avery's carefully folded statement from his coat. "Need to check some records about a freedman farmer named Matthew Carter." The clerk adjusted his spectacles. "Land records are in the basement. Debt claims, too." He hesitated. "Though most colored folks' papers ain't kept as careful as they should be." "Then we'll look extra careful," Thaddeus said quietly, but his tone made clear it wasn't a request. They spent hours in the dim basement poring over dusty ledgers by lamplight. Thaddeus's cold, stiffened fingers turned page after page, while the clerk muttered about wasted time. But near sunset, the older man paused, frowning at a notation. "Hold on here." He squinted at the faded ink. "Says something about a settlement letter, signed by Judge Harrison before he retired." The clerk scratched his chin. "He's living over in Miller's Creek now, 2 towns east." Thaddeus straightened, hope flickering to life. Could he verify if Carter's debt was settled? If anyone would know, it'd be Harrison. He handled most colored folks' cases back then, kept his own records too. Thaddeus bought paper and ink from the general store before it closed, then found a room at the boarding house. By lamplight, he carefully composed his letter to the judge, explaining Dinah's situation and the brothers' suspicious claim. His hands, still stiff from cold, made the writing slow and deliberate. The next morning, he took the letter to the telegraph office. The operator counted out the words, naming a price that would have bought supplies for a month. Thaddeus paid without hesitation. "Could be days before we hear back," the operator warned. "If the judge is even home." Thaddeus nodded, thinking of Dinah alone in his cabin, counting down the days until the brothers' deadline. "I'll wait." He found work chopping wood behind the boarding house to pay for his room, and spent hours in the courthouse basement, searching for any other documents that might help their case. Each night, he checked the telegraph office for news, only to be met with shakes of the head. The Bible remained close to his heart, its presence a constant reminder of all that was at stake. Not just land and a gravestone, but a woman's right to live with dignity, to be more than what others tried to make of her. As he waited for word from the judge, Thaddeus prayed in his own way, mixing his mother's traditions with the faith that sustained Dinah. The town buzzed with curiosity about the half-Cherokee mountain man who had ridden through winter storms to search through old records. Some whispered about his connection to the Carter girl, but Thaddeus kept his own counsel, speaking only when necessary and working steadily as the days stretched on. The mountain winds whispered lonely songs around the cabin's eaves. Dinah sat in her sturdy chair by the window, working steady stitches into a patch for Thaddeus's spare coat. 4 days had passed since he'd ridden out into the bitter cold, and worry gnawed at her like a hungry thing. She hummed softly as she sewed, an old spiritual her mama had taught her, "Guide my feet while I run this race." The familiar melody filled the quiet corners of the cabin, keeping darker thoughts at bay. Outside, fresh snow drifted against the door, and the afternoon light grew thin and gray. A knock startled her from her work. Dinah set aside her mending and approached the door cautiously, relief flooding through her when she heard Mrs. Dunham's voice calling her name. "Land sakes, child, you're looking peaked," the preacher's wife said as she bustled in, shaking snow from her shawl. She carried a covered basket that steamed in the cold air. Brought you some hot bread and beef stew." Dinah helped her visitor shed her wraps, genuinely glad for the company. "You're too kind, Mrs. Dunham. The trail must have been fearsome today." "Nothing compared to what your Mr. McGraw's facing, I expect." Mrs. Dunham began setting out the food on the rough-hewn table. "Any word yet?" "No, ma'am." Dinah's voice caught slightly. "But I reckon news travels slow in weather like this." They shared the meal together, the stew warming more than just their bodies. Mrs. Dunham spoke of town happenings, careful to avoid mention of the Rourke brothers or their threats. As she talked, her sharp eyes took in the neat cabin, the swept floor, the organized shelves, the fresh pine boughs, and a tin can bringing color to the windowsill. "You've made this place right homey," she observed. "Thaddeus McGraw might find it hard to go back to bachelor ways when you leave." Dinah's cheeks warmed at the gentle teasing, but before she could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Mrs. Avery, the midwife, her medical bag clutched in mittened hands. "Thought you might need checking on," she said, stamping snow from her boots. "Brought some dried herbs for tea, good for settling nerves." The three women spent the afternoon together, their conversation flowing easy as a spring creek. Mrs. Avery shared tales of babies she'd delivered in weather worse than this, while Mrs. Dunham worked on her knitting. Dinah listened and learned, tucking away bits of wisdom like seeds for future planting. As the light began to fade, both visitors prepared to leave. "You sure you'll be all right alone?" Mrs. Dunham asked, concern creasing her brow. Dinah straightened her shoulders. "Yes, ma'am. Thaddeus showed me how to work the shotgun, and there's plenty of wood split for the stove." After they'd gone, Dinah banked the fire for the night and settled into her evening routine. She read a chapter from her mother's Bible by lamplight, finding comfort in the familiar words of Psalm 23. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters Thaddeus had fixed before leaving. Near midnight, a new sound pulled her from restless sleep, the high, lonely call of a coyote, closer than she'd ever heard before. Dinah sat up in her bed, heart pounding. Another yip answered the first, then another. Moving quietly, she retrieved the shotgun from its place by the door. Thaddeus had shown her how to load and fire it, making her practice until her movements were sure. She checked that it was loaded, then settled into the chair by the window. The coyotes prowled closer, their shadows dark against the snow in the moonlight. Dinah's hands were steady on the weapon, though her throat felt dry as dust. She remembered Thaddeus's words. "They're more scared of us than we are of them most times. But best to show them early you ain't easy prey." When one of the creatures slunk too close to the cabin, Dinah opened the window a crack and fired once into the air. The sound crashed through the night like summer thunder, and the coyotes scattered into the darkness. Still, she kept her vigil until dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold. The next day, despite her sleepless night, Dinah threw herself into work. She swept the cabin, organized Thaddeus's collection of dried herbs, and spent hours at her mending. Her needle flew through fabric as she sang hymn after hymn, her clear voice rising above the wind's moan. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," she sang, working on a tear in one of his shirts. "That saved a wretch like me." The familiar words brought memories of church services back home, of her mama's voice joining hers in harmony. For the first time in days, tears pricked at her eyes. But Dinah didn't let herself cry for long. There was too much to be done, and she was not one for idle weeping. She wiped her eyes with her apron and moved on to making bread, kneading the dough with strong, sure hands. Each evening she prayed for Thaddeus's safety, adding special words for his mule and for clear paths through the snow. She prayed for the judge to remember the truth about her father's debt and for strength to face whatever answer came back. Sometimes she added a small prayer for the Rourke brothers, though that was harder. Days passed slow as molasses in winter. Dinah kept track of them with small marks on a piece of bark, watching the deadline draw closer. But she refused to let fear rule her. Instead, she focused on keeping the cabin warm and welcoming for Thaddeus's return, proving with every action that she was neither helpless nor broken by others' cruelty. When the coyotes returned 2 nights later, she met them with the same quiet strength, showing them once again that this territory was claimed. In the deep hours before dawn, as she kept her lonely watch, Dinah smiled to herself, remembering how folks in town used to whisper about her size, her supposed weaknesses. Let them see her now, protecting this mountain home with nothing but grit and a shotgun. Morning brought fresh snow and fresh determination. Dinah started another batch of bread, hung clean curtains made from flour sacks, and sang every hymn she knew. Her voice filled the cabin with hope, reaching toward the gray winter sky like smoke from the chimney, carrying prayers for Thaddeus's safe return. 4 days after his departure, hoofbeats echoed down Alder Creek's main street. Thaddeus McGraw rode in beside Sheriff Amos Kendall, both men's coats crusted with snow and ice. Their mounts moved wearily through the afternoon shadows, steam rising from their flanks. Behind them, the mountains loomed dark against gathering storm clouds. Mrs. Talbot spotted them first through the boarding house window. She hurried outside, wringing her hands in her apron. "Land sakes, you both look half frozen. Come in before you catch your death." The sheriff dismounted stiffly, his weathered face red from the biting wind. "Much obliged, ma'am. A few minutes by the fire wouldn't go amiss." Thaddeus tied both horses to the hitching post, his movements careful and deliberate. The long ride had taken its toll, but determination burned bright in his eyes. He followed the sheriff inside, where Mrs. Talbot already had coffee brewing on the parlor stove. "The Rourke brothers are still in town," she told them, pouring the steaming liquid into tin cups. "Been strutting around like roosters these past days, telling anyone who'll listen about their plans for the Carter place." Sheriff Kendall pulled a folded document from inside his coat. The paper was worn at the edges but still bore a clear seal. "Well now, seems we might have something to say about those plans." They warmed themselves just long enough to stop shivering. Thaddeus stood first, adjusting the pistol at his hip. "Best get this done before they catch wind we're here." Outside, the winter afternoon had turned gray and sharp. The brothers' horses stood hitched outside the saloon, their riders' voices carrying through the swinging doors. A small crowd had gathered near the general store, watching as Thaddeus and the sheriff approached. The youngest Rourke brother, Jonas, spotted them first. He elbowed Caleb, who stepped out onto the boardwalk with a sneer. "Well, if it ain't the half-breed mountain man, come to beg for your woman's land." "That's enough." Sheriff Kendall's voice cut through the cold air like an axe. "I've got business with you three." Levi Rourke, the eldest, emerged from the saloon. His hand rested near his gun belt. "We don't answer to the county seat. Town marshal already backed our claim." "That's so?" The sheriff unfolded the document. "Then you won't mind if I read what Judge Harrison had to say about that claim." More townspeople drifted closer, drawn by the tension crackling between the men. Mrs. Dunham and the midwife stood shoulder to shoulder near the dry goods store. The preacher watched from his church steps, and even the telegraph operator had stepped outside to listen. Sheriff Kendall cleared his throat and began to read. "I, Judge William Harrison, hereby attest that on the 15th day of May, 1878, Matthew Carter appeared before me with full payment for all debts owed to the Rourke family cattle operation. Said payment was accepted by Caleb Rourke Sr. in the amount of $325. All claims against the Carter homestead were at that time declared null and void." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Caleb's face had gone red as a summer apple. "That's a lie. Our pa never—" "Your father's signature is right here," the sheriff interrupted, turning the paper so everyone could see. "Along with mine as witness. Seems to me you boys either forgot about this settlement, or you were counting on nobody remembering it." Jonas made a move toward his gun, but Thaddeus's quiet voice stopped him. "Wouldn't do that, boy. Sheriff might take it personal." The townspeople's whispers grew louder. Mrs. Avery's voice carried clear across the street. "Shame on them, trying to steal from that poor girl after her daddy paid fair and square." Levi tried to salvage what he could. "That paper could be forged. And anyway, the girl's got no right to the land. She can't even—" "Can't what?" Thaddeus took a step forward, his eyes hard as river rocks. "Can't stand up to 3 men who'd rob a dead man's daughter. Can't see through your lies. Seems to me she's done both just fine." The sheriff carefully refolded the document. "This will be registered at the county seat tomorrow. Any further attempts to claim or harass the Carter property will be dealt with as criminal matters." He looked around at the gathered faces. "I trust everyone here heard that clear enough?" The brothers stood in sullen silence as realization sank in. Their scheme was exposed, their reputation crumbling like spring ice. Several townspeople who had been friendly to them days before now turned away in disgust. Mrs. Dunham spoke up from the crowd. "That girl's got more worth in her little finger than the lot of you put together. Teaching our children hymns, helping with the church suppers, while you three plotted to steal her inheritance." The town marshal had appeared during the reading, looking uncomfortable. Sheriff Kendall fixed him with a stern gaze. "I'll be having words with you later about proper investigation of property claims." Caleb spat in the snow. "Keep the worthless piece of dirt. No decent family would want it anyway." He turned to go, but Thaddeus's voice stopped him cold. "One more word against her," Thaddeus said quietly, "and we'll settle this another way." The promise in his tone needed no explanation. The brothers mounted up and rode out of town, their shoulders stiff with wounded pride. As they disappeared around the bend, someone in the crowd started to clap. Others joined in, the sound echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. Sheriff Kendall tucked the precious document into his coat. "Best get this somewhere safe for the night. Tomorrow we'll make it official." He turned to Thaddeus. "You riding up to tell her the news?" Thaddeus nodded, already moving toward his horse. The storm clouds were building over the peaks, but his heart felt lighter than it had in days. He had one more mountain to climb, but this time he carried hope in his saddlebags. Mrs. Talbot hurried over with a package wrapped in cloth. "Take this up to her. Fresh bread and some dried apples. Poor thing's probably worried sick about you." As Thaddeus mounted up, several townspeople stepped forward to shake his hand. The preacher called out a blessing, and Mrs. Dunham promised to visit once the weather cleared. Their words of support followed him up the street, a stark contrast to the whispers that had dogged Dinah months before. The three Rourke brothers mounted their horses with stiff movements, their faces dark with humiliation. The gathered townspeople watched in silence as Caleb yanked his mount's head around, nearly jerking the reins from the bit. The horse danced sideways, sensing its rider's anger. Dinah stood quietly between Mrs. Dunham and Thaddeus, her head held high despite the brothers' burning glares. The winter wind tugged at her shawl, but she didn't flinch or look away. She had spent too many months shrinking from their judgment. Jonas Rourke spurred his horse forward first, but Caleb shouldered past him. As he drew even with Dinah, he hawked and spat a glob of tobacco juice into the snow near her boots. "You ain't seen the last of us," he growled. Thaddeus took a half-step forward, but Dinah's gentle touch on his arm stopped him. The gesture wasn't lost on the watching crowd, nor was the way Caleb's face reddened further at this evidence of their closeness. "The Lord sees all hearts clear enough," Dinah said, her voice carrying in the crisp air. "I reckon that's judgment enough for anyone with sense to fear it." Levi, the eldest, grabbed Caleb's reins before he could respond. "We're done here," he snapped, though his own face was mottled with shame. The three brothers wheeled their horses around and spurred them into a trot, heading out of town as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. As soon as they disappeared around the bend, the townspeople surged forward. Mrs. Talbot was first, pressing a cloth-wrapped loaf of fresh bread into Dinah's hands. "Still warm from the oven, dear. You must be famished after all this excitement." "And these are for your spring garden," Mrs. Avery added, offering several small paper packets of seeds. "Sweet peas and marigolds, they'll look lovely along your front path." Tears welled in Dinah's eyes as more people stepped forward. The general store owner's wife brought a tin of hard candies. The blacksmith's daughter shyly offered a pair of warm mittens she had knitted herself. Even the telegraph operator, who had barely spoken to Dinah before, pressed 2 copper pennies into her palm for luck. "You'll come sing at service again this Sunday?" Mrs. Dunham asked, squeezing Dinah's hand. "The children have been asking when you'll teach them that new hymn you mentioned." Dinah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. These were the same people who had whispered behind their hands months ago, who had turned away when she walked past. Now they crowded close, offering support and kind words as naturally as breathing. The sheriff touched his hat brim. "I'll have this document properly filed first thing tomorrow," he said, patting his coat where the precious paper lay. "No one will trouble your claim again, Miss Carter. You have my word on that." "Much obliged, Sheriff," Thaddeus answered for her, his deep voice warm with gratitude. "We'd best head up before this weather turns, though." Indeed, the sky had grown heavy with snow-laden clouds, and the wind carried the sharp bite of an approaching storm. The townspeople stepped back, calling out final good wishes as Thaddeus helped Dinah mount his mule. He would walk beside her as always, leading the animal carefully along the familiar trail. As they left town, the last rays of sun broke briefly through the clouds, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. The air was crisp with the scent of pine, and their breath fogged in the gathering dusk. Neither spoke for the first mile, comfortable in the quiet company they had grown used to sharing. Finally, Dinah broke the silence. "I never thought to see the day when Mrs. Talbot would offer me fresh bread," she said softly, "or hear kind words from folks who wouldn't meet my eye before." "People can surprise you," Thaddeus replied. "Sometimes it just takes one person standing up to change how others see what's right." They walked on, the mule's hooves crunching in the snow. The forest was peaceful around them, dark pines standing sentinel against the dimming sky. A lone chickadee called from somewhere in the branches, its cheerful voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Come spring, we should look at fixing up your pa's place," Thaddeus said after a while. "Roof might need some work after the winter storms." Dinah's heart lifted at the casual way he said we. "The garden needs turning too," she added. "I was thinking maybe to plant some winter squash along with the usual beans and corn, and perhaps a few flowers now that I have the seeds." "Flowers would be nice," Thaddeus agreed. "Your ma would have liked that, I expect." "She would." Dinah smiled, remembering her mother's love of growing things. She always said a garden needed both beauty and usefulness to be properly balanced. They discussed plans as they walked, which fences needed mending, where to build a new chicken coop, how to improve the spring house. Simple, practical matters that somehow held the weight of promise in every word. Dinah felt lighter with each step, as if months of worry were falling away like snow from pine boughs in the sun. The cabin appeared ahead, a welcoming shape in the gathering dark. Smoke curled from the chimney where Mrs. Dunham's eldest boy had kept the fire going during their absence. Light gleamed through the window, warm and steady as a beacon. Thaddeus helped Dinah down from the mule, his hands gentle and sure. "Home safe," he said quietly. She looked up at him, this man who had changed her life with one simple act of kindness months ago. "Yes," she replied. "Home safe." Inside, the cabin was warm and snug against the rising wind. While Thaddeus tended to the mule, Dinah set out their simple supper, Mrs. Talbot's fresh bread, some dried venison, and the last of the autumn applesauce. The familiar tasks felt different somehow, touched with a new sense of possibility. When Thaddeus came in, stamping snow from his boots, Dinah was humming one of her mother's old hymns. The tune filled the cabin with comfort, as natural as breathing. They sat down to eat together, two souls who had found unexpected friendship in the long winter months, now facing spring with hope in their hearts. March arrived with warmer winds and longer days. The deep blanket of snow that had covered the Carter homestead all winter began to retreat, revealing patches of dark earth beneath. Each morning brought more bare ground and with it the promise of spring's renewal. Dinah stood on her father's porch watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The old cabin needed work. Winter storms had loosened some of the shingles, and one window shutter hung crooked, but it was still home. Her home. The thought no longer carried the weight of fear it once had. The crunch of boots on half-frozen ground made her turn. Thaddeus approached from the trail, carrying tools over his shoulder. He'd been coming by most mornings lately, always finding some task that needed his attention. Today he carried a post hole digger and several lengths of fresh-cut rail. "Thought we might tackle that broken fence line today," he said by way of greeting. Weather's fair enough for it. Dinah nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. I've got coffee on the stove if you'd like some before we start. They shared the hot coffee in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher. Through the kitchen window, Dinah could see the plot where her father's garden had been. Last year's dead stalks still stood in ragged rows, but beneath them, she knew the soil waited for new planting. After coffee, they set to work on the fence. The winter had been hard on the old rails, and several sections had collapsed under the weight of snow. Thaddeus worked methodically, digging new post holes while Dinah cleared away the broken pieces. The labor was heavy, but she was stronger than she'd been in the fall, months of cabin chores having built up her endurance. "You're good at this," Thaddeus commented as she fitted a rail into place. "Most folks would have given up by now." "Papa always said anything worth having was worth working for," she replied, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cool air. "He built all this himself, you know. Every fence post, every board." Thaddeus nodded, understanding in his eyes. Good man's work should be honored by keeping it strong. Around mid-morning, they heard wagon wheels approaching. It was the Dunham family, their cart loaded with wooden crates. Mrs. Dunham waved cheerfully as her husband brought the horses to a stop. "We brought you something," she called out, gesturing to the crates. Curious clucking sounds emerged from within. "Chickens?" Dinah asked, setting down her hammer. "6 good laying hens and a rooster," Mr. Dunham confirmed. "Fine stock from our own coop. Every homestead needs chickens, we figured." More visitors arrived throughout the day. The blacksmith brought a repaired plow he'd been working on all winter. Mrs. Avery arrived with seed potatoes saved from her cellar. Even old Mr. Peterson, who rarely left his farm, drove up in his buggy to deliver a box of tools, some new, some well-worn, but serviceable. "Can't have a carter working this land with poor equipment," he said gruffly, though his eyes were kind. "Your pa would have done the same for any of us." Dinah had to turn away to hide her tears, touched by the generosity of neighbors who had once shunned her. Thaddeus's quiet presence at her side steadied her, as it had so many times before. By late afternoon, they had company in the work. Young Tom Dunham helped clear stones from the garden plot while his father and Thaddeus finished the fence line. Mrs. Dunham and Mrs. Avery helped Dinah clean out the chicken coop, sharing stories and laughter as they worked. "You know," Mrs. Dunham said as they spread fresh straw, "several of the mothers were talking. We've been wondering if you might consider teaching some of the children their letters. The schoolhouse is too far for the little ones in winter, and we've all noticed how well you work with them at church." Dinah paused, surprised by the request. I'd be honored, but where?" "Right here in your kitchen would do fine. It's central enough for most families, and plenty warm with that big stove." The idea took root in Dinah's heart, growing stronger as she considered it. Her mother had taught her to read from the family Bible, spending patient hours helping her sound out the words. The thought of passing on that gift to others felt right, like completing a circle. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. The sun was setting when the last of the neighbors left, leaving Dinah's homestead transformed. The fence stood straight and strong, the garden plot was cleared for planting, and contented clucking came from the chicken coop. Tools filled the shed, and promises of more help with spring planting hung in the air. Thaddeus lingered as twilight deepened, checking the new fence posts one last time. Dinah watched him from the porch, noting how he took such care with every detail. He'd been doing that more often lately, finding small tasks that needed attention, staying until the day's last light faded. "Would you like to stay for supper?" she asked. "It's just beans and cornbread, but there's plenty." He straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "Much obliged," he said, and something in his voice made her heart beat faster. They ate by lamplight, talking about plans for the garden and which crops to plant first. Thaddeus suggested building a proper gate for the chicken yard, and Dinah shared her ideas for arranging the kitchen for teaching. Their conversation flowed easily, comfortable as an old quilt. "I reckon I'll need a bigger table," she mused, looking at her father's old pine table. "Can't have children trying to write on their laps." "I could make one," Thaddeus offered. "Got some good board seasoning in my shed. Could have it done before you start teaching." You don't have to. I know, he said simply, I want to. Their eyes met across the table, and Dinah felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. Here was a man who had never seen her size as a burden, who valued her strength instead of shaming it, who found reasons to stay, not excuses to leave. Thank you, she said softly, meaning far more than just the offer of a table. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering night. Inside, two people who had found unexpected friendship in winter's isolation sat together in companionable silence, watching the lamplight dance on simple wooden walls that held so many new possibilities. April brought warmth back to the Colorado territory, painting the land in delicate shades of green and gold. Along Alder Creek, clusters of tiny purple and yellow wildflowers pushed through the last patches of melting snow, their bright faces turning toward the strengthening sun. The air carried the sweet scent of new growth and possibility. Thaddeus led his old mule down the narrow trail from his mountain cabin one last time, a small wagon creaking behind them. He had spent the morning gathering his belongings, worn books, trapper's tools, his mother's cast-iron cookware, and the sturdy rocking chair his father had made. The decision to leave his solitary life hadn't been difficult. The mountain shelter had served him well through lonely years, but now it felt as empty as a hollow tree. The Carter homestead came into view as he rounded the last bend. Dinah stood at the newly mended gate, her dark skin glowing in the morning light. She wore a fresh apron over her calico dress, and her smile widened at the sight of him. "Welcome home," she called softly, opening the gate wide. Those simple words wrapped around Thaddeus's heart like a warm blanket. He led the mule through, noting how Dinah had already prepared a space in the barn. Fresh hay filled the stall, and a new water trough sat ready. "You've been busy," he remarked, beginning to unload the wagon. "Had to make sure everything was proper," she replied, helping him carry his books inside. A home should welcome folks right. They worked together through the morning, finding places for his belongings among hers. His mother's cookware nested perfectly beside Dinah's pots. The rocking chair settled into a corner by the window as if it had always been there. Even his worn quilt seemed to belong, their faded colors complementing the ones Dinah had inherited from her mother. After the wagon was empty, they turned their attention to the garden. The soil had thawed enough for planting, and Dinah had already marked out neat rows with string and stakes. They worked side by side, dropping early bean seeds into the dark earth. "Mama always said beans were lucky," Dinah commented, carefully covering each seed. "First to sprout, last to finish. Reliable, like good friends." Thaddeus nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words. "My mother had a saying, too, that plants grow best where they're wanted. Reckon that's true for people as well." In the afternoon, Dinah brought out a can of white paint she'd traded for in town. The porch railing had weathered to gray over the years, but now she was determined to brighten it. Thaddeus watched as she worked, her brush strokes careful and steady. "Papa always meant to paint it," she explained, dipping her brush again. "Said a proper home should look loved. I figure it's time." The fresh paint transformed the old railing, making it gleam in the spring sunlight. Like a new start, Thaddeus thought, watching her work, like hope made visible. Around 4 o'clock, they heard hoofbeats approaching. The Reverend Dunham rode up on his bay mare, his black coat dusted with pollen from the blooming trees. He dismounted with a warm smile, taking in the newly painted porch and the garden rows. "I thought I might stop by," he said, removing his hat. "See how you're settling in." They invited him inside, where Dinah served coffee and the last of her winter preserves. The preacher sat at the kitchen table, his eyes noting how naturally their possessions mingled. Thaddeus's books beside Dinah's Bible, their chairs drawn close together. "The Lord's hand moves in wonderful ways," Reverend Dunham said thoughtfully. "Sometimes what looks like hardship leads us to exactly where we're meant to be." He stood, reaching for his worn leather satchel. "Would you mind if I offered a blessing for your home?" Dinah's eyes brightened with tears. "We'd be honored, Reverend." They stood together as the preacher's voice filled the cabin, asking for peace and prosperity to dwell within its walls. His words acknowledged their past struggles while celebrating their present joy, and when he finished, even Thaddeus had to clear his throat against unexpected emotion. "Thank you," Dinah whispered, squeezing the preacher's hand. After the Reverend rode away, the day settled into evening with gentle grace. They sat together on the freshly painted porch, listening to the river's song mixing with the evening birds. The air grew cool, but neither moved to go inside just yet. "You know," Dinah said after a while, her voice thoughtful, "I used to feel that sign's shame like a weight around my neck. Everywhere I went, I imagined people seeing those words instead of seeing me." Thaddeus turned to look at her, noting how the sunset painted her face in soft gold. "And now?" "Now?" She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Now I know my worth isn't measured in children or other folks' judgment. It's measured in work done well, in kindness given freely, in making a home where people feel welcome." She gestured to the freshly planted garden, the painted porch, the warm light spilling from their windows. "In building something good with someone who sees me true." Thaddeus reached over and took her hand, his rough fingers gentle against her palm. They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared, two people who had found in each other something greater than the sum of their past hurts. The river murmured its ancient song, and somewhere in the growing darkness, a whippoorwill called. The scent of wildflowers drifted up from the creek, mingling with the clean smell of fresh paint. Inside their home, lamplight gleamed on well-worn furniture and carefully placed belongings, each item a testament to lives now woven together like strong, sturdy cloth. From the barn came the soft nickering of Thaddeus's mule, settling into its new home. In the chicken coop, the hens clucked quietly as they roosted. All around them, the land held the promise of growth, beans pushing through soil, flowers opening to sun, hearts healing in the warmth of acceptance freely given. Summer settled over the Colorado territory like a warm blanket, turning the mountain slopes to endless shades of green. At the Carter homestead, the garden flourished under Dinah's careful tending. Neat rows of corn reached toward the sky, their leaves rustling in the afternoon breeze. Bean vines climbed sturdy poles, heavy with pods, while squash plants spread their broad leaves across the dark soil. The vegetable patch had grown 3 times its original size since spring, fed by rich compost and daily care. Each morning brought the cheerful sounds of children's voices as they made their way down the dusty road. Some rode double on spare ponies, others walked, but all carried slates or books wrapped in cloth. They came from farms and ranches scattered across the valley, drawn by Dinah's patient teaching and Thaddeus's practical wisdom. On this particular morning in late June, 8 children gathered under the big cottonwood tree where Dinah had set up a makeshift classroom. Wooden crates served as seats, and a smooth board propped between 2 stumps made a fine writing surface. Sarah Jenkins, a freckled 10-year-old, carefully formed her letters while her younger brother Tommy bounced with impatience, eager for the afternoon when Thaddeus would teach whittling. "Steady now," Dinah encouraged, her voice warm as honey. "Good penmanship takes time, just like growing vegetables or building a fence." She moved between the students, adjusting grips on pencils and praising neat work. The children had long since stopped noticing her size or color, seeing only the kindness in her eyes and the strength in her capable hands. Near the barn, Thaddeus worked at his bench preparing for the afternoon's lesson. His skilled fingers sorted through pieces of soft pine, selecting ones perfect for small hands to learn on. He had discovered a gift for teaching that surprised even him, finding joy in showing young ones how to use tools safely and well. "Mr. McGraw," little Joey Miller called out, waving his slate, "can we help feed the chickens at noon?" Thaddeus looked up, smiling beneath his beard. "Reckon those hens would appreciate that. Might even have some eggs to collect." The morning passed in a pleasant mix of lessons and chores. Dinah taught reading and sums, weaving in stories about plants and animals that kept even the most restless children engaged. During breaks, they helped water the garden or gather eggs, learning through doing as much as through books. After the midday meal, Thaddeus gathered the children around his workbench. "Now, remember what we talked about with knife safety," he began. his deep voice serious but kind. "Every cut goes away from yourself, never toward. Keep your fingers clear of the blade." He demonstrated on a piece of pine, showing how to find the grain and work with it. The children watched intently, their faces serious with concentration. Even the youngest knew this was a grown-up task requiring care and attention. "What are we making today?" asked Mary Thompson, her dark braids tied with faded ribbon. "Thought we might try some simple spoons," Thaddeus replied. "Your Maz might appreciate having extra for stirring and such." The afternoon filled with the soft sounds of whittling and occasional questions. Thaddeus moved between the children, adjusting grips and offering quiet encouragement. He had taught them all equally, boys and girls alike, knowing that practical skills knew no gender. As the sun began its westward slide, Mrs. Abigail Dunham arrived in her wagon, bringing fresh bread and paint. She had been eager to help with Dinah's idea for the old sign, understanding the power of transforming something hurtful into something healing. The children helped clean up the wood chips and put away tools before heading home, each proudly carrying their day's work. Several mothers arrived to collect younger ones, stopping to chat with Dinah about their children's progress or share recipes. "Such a blessing having you teach them," Mrs. Miller said, adjusting her youngest on her hip. "Joey never took to books before, but now he reads to his little sister every night." Dinah smiled, touched by the simple praise. "Children learn best where they feel wanted," she replied, echoing Thaddeus's words about plants from months ago. As the families departed, Mrs. Dunham helped Dinah and Thaddeus carry supplies to the porch. The old cottonwood sign lay flat on sawhorses, its cruel words already sanded away to fresh wood. They worked together with brushes and white paint, covering the past with clean possibility. "The Lord works in wonderful ways," Mrs. Dunham remarked, carefully painting the border. "Who would have thought that old sign would become something beautiful?" Dinah nodded, her brush strokes sure and steady as she formed the new letters. "All are welcome here." "Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the sweetest destinations," she said softly, glancing at Thaddeus. He looked up from mixing more paint, his eyes crinkling at the corners. They needed no words to express what had grown between them, a love built on understanding, respect, and shared purpose. As evening approached, neighbors began arriving for the weekly community supper, a tradition that had started naturally as the homestead became a gathering place. They carried covered dishes and fresh-picked flowers, children running ahead to help set up tables in the yard. The new sign dried in the last sunlight as people settled in to share food and conversation. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the gathering, their light catching the fresh white paint. Someone brought out a fiddle, and soon toe-tapping music mixed with laughter and talk. Dinah moved among the guests, making sure everyone had enough to eat. Her father would have been proud to see the homestead full of life and purpose. She paused near the porch steps, taking in the scene, children playing tag between the tables, older folks sharing stories, young couples stealing glances across plates of cornbread and berry pie. Thaddeus came to stand beside her, their shoulders touching lightly. Neither spoke for a moment, both understanding that some joy runs too deep for words. The sign above them caught the evening breeze, its message clear and strong against the darkening sky. "You've built something special here," Mrs. Dunham said, joining them on the steps. "A place where folks can just be themselves, no matter what others might say." Dinah smiled, watching a group of children teach Thaddeus's latest whittling student how to hold his knife properly. "We all need somewhere to belong," she said, "somewhere that sees past the surface to who we really are." The evening deepened into dusk, but no one seemed eager to leave. More lanterns were lit, casting pools of golden light across the yard. Someone started a hymn, and soon voices joined in harmony, rising sweet and clear into the summer night. Dinah's voice lifted with them, strong and true as ever. Thaddeus watched her sing, remembering that first day by the creek when he had found her among the cottonwoods. How far they had come from that winter afternoon, not just in seasons, but in healing. Their worth had never depended on what others thought or on having children to carry their names. It lived in the garden's abundance, in the children's eager learning, in the community gathered around their table. The new sign caught the lantern light, its letters glowing softly. Below it, neighbors shared dessert and stories. Children dozed in parents' laps, and the evening breeze carried the mingled scents of good food and summer flowers. It was exactly what a home should be, not just a place to live, but a harbor for hearts seeking welcome. Laughter spilled into the warm evening as someone told a funny story. Dinah and Thaddeus exchanged another look, one that held all their shared journey in its depths. The truth they had discovered was simple but profound. Love grew best where it was given freely, without conditions or requirements. Like the beans in their garden, it flourished in soil made rich by care and acceptance. As stars began to appear above the mountains, the gathering showed no signs of ending. More stories were shared, more songs sung, more pieces of pie distributed. The homestead glowed with warmth and welcome, just as the new sign promised, a beacon of hope and belonging in the Colorado night. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.